At least 31 people are dead this weekend after two mass shootings in the United States. Both attacks were carried out by American citizens. Today we ask on the stream, why isn't the US doing more to stop white supremacist violence? I'm Femi Oke, and you know the drill. Please send us your thoughts via Twitter or live on YouTube. Just hours ago, President Donald Trump addressed the nation about the attacks.
The shooter in El Paso posted a manifesto online consumed by racist hate. In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. These sinister ideologies must be defeated. Hate has no place in America. We have asked the FBI to identify all further resources they need to investigate and disrupt hate crimes and domestic terrorism.
For the first time, Trump acknowledged the nation's white supremacy problem. So will anything change now? Joining us, Emily Gosensky. She's an extremism researcher from Charlottesville, Virginia. She's currently living in Berlin, Germany. Richard Pineda is an associate professor of communications at the University of Texas in El Paso. And we also have Mark Bray, professor of history at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Thank you, guests, for being part of our show today. Richard, I have to ask you about El Paso. As you're going about your business today, what is the atmosphere like? What are people saying to each other?
Well, it's an incredibly somber Monday. An incident like this is something that's unprecedented in El Paso's history. I think it's also something that really tears at the heart of our community. We have more than 700,000 residents, and we are largely a Mexican-American community with strong ties to Juarez and in the state of Chihuahua. I think something like this is really just difficult to explain. The community has rallied in a way that makes me incredibly proud, but the thought that on Saturday such a huge part of this community was impacted, and the idea that people who look like me and look like my daughter were targeted by the alleged gunman is really just heartbreaking.
Just getting a sense of what it must be like to be in an attack like that, I wanted to share with you a little moment from a survivor called Maribel Latin. Here she is. Have a look.
We had nowhere to run. There was no way we could have ran out of there. I hid behind the SUV that was there, behind the tire, and I looked to the front. This guy was 2 cars away from us, just shooting at us. And I saw him reload his gun and walk towards us again. And he just cold-bloodedly came straight at us and shot us. He shot 8 rounds. I had to pretend I was dead. And he was right next to me. And he shot 8 more rounds. And all I could say is, God, please take care of my children. And please don't let him do anything to my daughter or any of the girls in our team.
Emily, for so many of us who live in the United States, that is a terrifying situation that we've all thought, what would we do if we were in a mass shooting situation? And you know what that's like. Do you mind sharing that insight with us? Because you are a survivor too.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a survivor of a mass shooting. That's certainly a unique experience, but I was there in Charlottesville 2 years ago when a neo-Nazi drove his car into our peaceful protest. And there's a moment in that where you realize what's happening, and it's almost like just half a heartbeat that you have to gather your thoughts to figure out what is happening. And for us, we were in a protest scenario, and some of us had trained for things like this. And so you just spring into action and you let your instinct take over. It's chaos, and you focus on the thing that you can do, and you hope to do that.
Mark, as a historian who actually looks at white nationalism, white supremacy, how do you actually understand what's been happening in the US right now, and this weekend in particular?
Well, it's part of a broader trend, of course. We can see, apart from the fact that the history of white supremacy, slavery, and genocide goes back centuries, and we should never forget these histories when we talk about this kinds of violence. over the last few years, it's clear that Trump's campaign for the presidency has emboldened the alt-right, this new kind of manifestation of far-right politics. And they present themselves as the defenders of what they claim are traditional values. Of course, it's all made up, but this notion that the United States ought to be a white country, this notion that gender means something very specific and eternal, they make up these myths, present themselves as defenders of it, and respond violently.
I feel
Given the violence is an inherent part of their politics, no matter how they present them. And I also just want to add one little thing that I think we ought to be a little bit cautious about some of the language around the word terrorism, because that kind of language sometimes normalizes the violence of the police, the military, and the prison system, which is also complicit in broader systems of violent white supremacy.
Mark, what language should we be using then to describe what's happened over just this weekend and then continues to keep happening with mass shootings?
Well, I mean, I liked how you presented it, honestly. You presented it as white supremacist violence. I mean, I understand why people are pushing back against the notion of terrorism being exclusively something that in this country the media presents as something done by Muslims, for example, and to show that actually, if we're thinking in those terms, white supremacist violence is the main issue. But we can also see how that language was attempted to be used against antifa and left-wing anti-racists recently by Ted Cruz, Trump, and others. That feels like a million years ago because it's been shown to be so ludicrous, but I think that shows the danger implicit in it.
Richard, I want to play you a little bit of a clip from another El Paso resident, and she points to the hypocrisy of the emotion that's happening right now, bearing in mind the context with which we're all living in the United States. This is Cassandra Alicia.
White supremacy, in any extension of it, any form of it, has just been so accepted here, specifically at the border with ICE detentions, with the militarization of the border, with border militias or right-wing Nazis coming to occupy the border and no one denouncing it. And it's infuriating to see hypocrites who are complicit in these ideologies, who have voted for Trump, who back the NRA, who again normalize white supremacy, normalize Nazis, want to accept them in our, not just in our community, but everywhere, all of a sudden mourn and grieve and share the condolences. That's infuriating to me.
Richard.
Well, I think to the point that Cassandra makes, and certainly to Mark's point, I think that one thing that you're already seeing is a shift in the rhetoric the Republican Party has used. So yesterday, both Ted Cruz and George P. Bush talked about this as an incident of white terrorism. I think Mark's caution is right, which is we've got to be careful with the way that language gets used. And it's avoiding, I think, another crucial issue, which is the question of gun rights and the permeability of weapons use in the United States. I think that it's one of the dangers in a moment right after an incident like this is that there's a number of different issues which are conflated and put together. And I think that there has to be a lot of caution, not only on the part of experts, but also I think in terms of media coverage to really draw some delineations between that. And I think that part of this positioning, at least rhetorically, from a political perspective, to move to talking about white terrorism is in fact, as Mark points out, ceding this to a larger picture. And I think that may be a disservice to the specifics of these incidents. And in this particular case, the specifics of being a very particular anti-Hispanic or anti-Latino effort.
Sure. But, gentlemen, may I just put this to you, and this comes from John Bash. He's the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Texas. I'm going to show you what he said in the last 48 hours. And this is talking about what happened in El Paso. We are treating it as a domestic terrorism case, and we're going to do what we do to terrorists in this country, which is deliver swift and certain justice. Mark, should I assume that this is language that you do not like?
That would be a correct assumption. I understand where he's coming from, right? He works through the legal process, but that language, of course, sounds good when it's used against neo-Nazis who are murdering people. Then, it seems self-evident. But historically, it's been used against black nationalist groups, against anarchists, against socialists, against a wide variety of radicals, many of whom haven't even always been charged for doing anything violent at all. So I just think that the language of terrorism sometimes makes the politics irrelevant right? Because it's just about the act, but we have to always think of these acts in terms of the politics and never let the right try to hide the role of white supremacy in what's going on.
Emily, let's talk about the politics then and do it straight on. I want to introduce you to Erin Coulihan. Again, she's a writer. She lives in El Paso, Texas, so she is talking from experience of what has happened just to her community. This is what she says about why is this happening?
The issue is not that Texas or America has been invaded by migrants. The issue is that our government has been infected by racist politicians. The manifesto that led to the destruction of my city on Saturday was taken directly from statements made by President Trump. Senator John Cornyn has made tweets about the way that there are 9 Hispanics moving to Texas per every white person. Governor Greg Abbott laments the fact that Texas is number 2 in gun sales where we can't be number 1. They are encouraging anti-immigrant thoughts and racism and violence.
Emily, I want you to tell our audience something before you address what the points that Erin just brought up, and that is why you decided to study hate groups. It is connected directly to what happened to you in Charlottesville. Can you just tell us that, if you don't mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I found was that there's a lot of lack of understanding about what these hate groups stand for, what motivates their actions, what motivates their level of violence, how they organize, and things like that. And so what I wanted to do was try to contextualize in a language that people understand when they are not deeply engaged with this material, and try to make clear the politics of that underlie the violence, and to try to communicate that these are politics that are not very far from mainstream, that they're very normalized, and that the way that we need to fight these types of violent acts is not to look at the act itself and to try to write laws or use certain enhancements to crimes or things like that, but to understand that these are mainstream politics.
But Emily, let me push you a little bit. Because of what happened to you in Charlottesville, that is why you're doing this research. I don't want to put words in your mouth. You tell us.
Yeah, I think that this is partly in response to Charlottesville, to what happened there. They came into my town. They caused these riots. They targeted me.
And we're looking at those pictures right now, Emily, so people can just be reminded about what they did. Richard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Richard, one of the thoughts that's going around right now is that President Trump, although he has called out white supremacy, is being connected to certainly the rhetoric that is going around right now in terms of racism or immigrants. And you live in El Paso, you've got an even better viewpoint on what this does to a community than many of us. Can you share that, please?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think one of the things that people are missing, I mean, there's not a one-to-one relationship in so much as the president says X and it results in Y. But remember, the most basic symbolic interaction that a politician has is to convince people to vote for them based on their ideas. And so it's not a stretch to assume that if a president is using literal or hate-filled language, or more than anything else, allowing people to use that in his presence. I mean, when you go to the rallies, and I got to see the rally in El Paso from a unique vantage point, you see how these crowds get stoked up. And I think that's one of the issues that we're not talking about. So it goes beyond just the president saying these things. It's also allowing these things to be said in his name and in his presence. I think that gives permissibility. And what I think my panelists would agree with is that over the course of the last 3.5 years, that permissibility has led to greater visibility for a lot of folks who are pursuing a very particular agenda. That's not to equate every Trump voter or supporter in that vein, but the truth is that as long as the president is not held accountable, is not given some responsibility to say these are things that I've helped stoke up, then every offhanded joke at a rally, every comment about sending people back, those things start to take their toll. And as somebody who has just watched this, I mean, in the way Emily saw this in the Charlottesville incident, I mean, it is heartbreaking because it means that people who have a particular agenda are stoked on to do very horrible things. And they have as Emily pointed out, come to my community and have destroyed the sense of safety and sanctity that we have here.
Sure.
Yeah, and also, if I could just add that, clearly Trump's comments about disowning white supremacy are his effort to hold on to some moderate semblance of mainstream respectability, while the vast majority of his actions and his comments have fostered a climate, right? So that's, I think, what Richard was what he was getting at, is that it's not just about what he says, it's fostering this climate where white supremacists or just really angry young white men interpret his comments in ways that lend permissibility to these kinds of acts.
Let me share with you a couple of comments from our online community. Samata says here, as long as the President of the United States doesn't tone down on his tweets against people of colour and of different religious beliefs, the shootings won't stop. Let me share with you another thought. This one comes from Abdul. Abdul says the greatest threat in modern America remains white supremacist males. People who think they are better than their fellow humans, slightly depressed youths who can order guns online with no checks whatsoever. A couple of thoughts there as to what is causing this actual rise in the number of white supremacist attacks. And you don't have to take my word for it, because there was a hearing earlier on this year in April, and I want to share a little bit of that with you, because these are where the hard stats come from. Have a listen, have a look.
White supremacists in the United States have experienced a resurgence in the past 3 years, driven in large part by the rise of the alt-right. There is also a clear corollary, as our research shows, to the rise in polarizing and hateful rhetoric on the part of candidates and elected leaders. This is a particularly dangerous problem. White supremacists have been responsible for more than half, 54% of all domestic extremist-related murders in the past 10 years. And in the last year, that figure has risen to 78% of all extremist-related murders.
Emily, I'm looking at some of the research that you're pulling together. You even look at the kind of person who will go out and shoot multiple numbers of people. So that was from the Judiciary Committee hearing on hate crimes and the rise of white nationalism in April. So we're looking at perhaps the President of the United States stoking up so much rhetoric about immigrants and race. But what else could possibly be causing this uptick on the number of attacks by white supremacists, white nationalists?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that has been growing for more than just the past 3 years. We have seen the seeds of this planted in online harassment campaigns going back to the earlier part of this decade. And before that, we've seen a 20 or 30-year erosion of the protections that we have against police violence. So we're seeing more police violence, and crucially, the types of language that we see with those types of killings, like language like "I felt afraid for my life, and so I had to shoot him." We're actually seeing that being manifest in the defenses of these violent actors when they do get caught and brought to trial. And so when you have somebody like the president, who is in the most scrutinized office in the world, doing things like saying, "Oh, if you punch these protesters, I'll pay their legal bills," whether it's a joke or not is irrelevant. People hear that and they think that they have carte blanche to go out and commit violence, and that they have the formula already. And so between the well-practiced online harassment, where they have refined their techniques of plausible deniability, to the tacit and explicit support of people in charge, we're going to see more violence, and it's going to keep increasing.
Mark, go ahead.
Also, I mean, I think seeing it in the context of the Obama presidency, of the demographic shifts in the country, of the prominence of Spanish as a second language in the country, the increasing role of Latinx populations, struggles around gay and trans liberation. There are a lot of people out there who feel, predominantly white people, who feel threatened by these kinds of changes. And if they have politicians whispering in their ear that you are under attack, then that's a message that's going to spur a lot of violence in response.
Mark, I'm really glad that you talked about before President Trump, because these incidences were happening a long time before he was president. Richard, when we're looking at this issue, goodness, you're right in the center of one of the worst massacres from this year, I should say from this week, because sadly in America there are many, many, many mass shootings. What do you see as a way forward? You're mourning with your community right now. How do you get beyond this? How do you stop other communities having to go through what you're going through right now?
Well, I think one thing is really pushing this idea of responsibility for speech. I mean, I think both the point that Emily and Mark are making is well taken, which is extremism has unfettered access on digital platforms. I mean, the manifesto, for example, was reproduced, 100-fold on Saturday morning.
And
that,
Richard,
that idea...
you just casually drop in the manifesto because everybody knows about that. But apparently, the shooter of the El Paso victims or people who were attacked wrote down a whole list of things. And I suppose you could say that they were white nationalist, white supremacist thoughts, and people are calling that his manifesto. Sorry to interrupt you. Please carry on.
No, that's okay. So this document, I mean, at this point, law enforcement seems to be pretty certain that this, in fact, was something that the shooter wrote. But that idea that you've got these channels to magnify hate, and I think that in the sort of Facebook generation, you have a very transitory responsibility. So people are willing to throw verbal and rhetorical hand grenades and walk away from the consequences of those actions. I mean, we have to have conversations about responsibility when it comes to speech. And I think the other thing that we're seeing as a result of some of this, some of the change in political tone, is that people are drawing lines in the sand about how much they're willing to engage with somebody. So if you disagree with me, that suddenly becomes the reason that we cannot talk anymore. And, that's anathema for the way that democracy works. You've got to be able to have disagreements, and they can't be something that cuts you off from the rest of civil society. And so I think, those of us that are in El Paso, I think we yesterday was amazing. I mean, people came together by the thousands for vigils. And as I said, the sense today, while one full of sadness and despair, also shows some hope. And that is that this is a community that is resilient, that deals with these kinds of circumstances and outside pressure and can unify as one. I think this is absolutely the moment when El Paso can lead, not only in terms of how we act and how we talk, but the idea of inspiring people to have conversations that go deeper than just, do you agree with me or do you disagree with me?
Let me just share these two thoughts with you from our online community as they're joining in our conversation. Celeste lives in El Paso. She mentions the 800 gorilla in the room, pound gorilla in the room. We need stronger gun control legislation on the books. That is a conversation that continues every time there is a mass shooting. And then this thought here from H.G. Flores, who's following our conversation live. The president has been held accountable via non-stop condemning of every anti-immigrant remark. What is needed is solutions to white nationalism. I also found, Mark, this was quite intriguing, Project Safe Neighborhoods. I was looking to see what the federal government was doing to try and help stop white nationalism, white supremacy, and they are doing these neighborhood education, what you do when you see somebody who may well possibly display some indication that they might create harm for other people. In terms of the federal response, just very briefly, what do you make of it?
Well, first, obviously, we need to talk about guns. That is obvious. But we also need to talk about disarming the police. We can't forget about that part of the conversation. As far as police responses to the far right, I think it's worth treating these initiatives with a bit of skepticism, given the FBI's documentation of massive white power infiltration into law enforcement. I don't have a lot of faith in the police to be able to carry this out. I think that we need to really direct it at the root of where it's coming from politically and organize communities that can respond.
Sure. Mark, I'm going to wrap up the conversation now, only because we have to, because we're out of time. But I want to say thank you very much to Mark and Richard and Emily for helping us understand the two mass shootings just a little bit better that happened in the United States over the weekend. Thank you very much, guests. We really appreciate you. Changing topic, but something equally as controversial. Let me show you this. It's a trailer for a new film about Harriet Tubman. Have a look.
You got to be miles away from here for dawn. Where is she? Follow that North Star. If there are no stars, just follow the river. Listen for them. Fear is your enemy. Whoa, easy now.
I'm gonna be free or die.
An iconic character being played by a black British actress. Why are people online saying #NotMyHarriet? We'll find out in the next episode of AJ Stream. See you then. Thanks for watching, everybody.